Could you click that, Bruce? Okay, so here we go. Good evening, everybody. Welcome once again. We're here going to talk about the Heart Sutra, which we, as you all know, we chant that every Sunday, and it's kind of an important part of Buddhism. It's probably the most well-known sutra out there. I'm going to start today by talking about stories. The Heart Sutra is a story. All sutras end up being stories. I've got a couple right here. I'll just quote little bits from the Lotus Sutra. It's a big story, but it's a story. When you start looking at stories, there are stories within stories. So the first story I'll talk about is not so much the story within the Lotus Sutra, but the story of how the Lotus Sutra got to us. I'm not going to get bogged down in that because you could spend years and years of academic study, but just a little bit of framework to set the stage. And the reason for spending time on the stories is understanding the layers of stories. This one, by the way, I waved at you. It's a big story. It has the same story about how it came to us, which itself is an interesting story. There are 28 chapters in here. Each of those is a separate story. Within those, there are parables, and each of those, so you've got stories within stories within stories. Understanding how all this is constructed actually helps us interpret it and incorporate that and use that in our practice. It's not this is just an intellectual exercise. This is to try and help ground it and make it useful, try and help pass out how to make it useful. So the story of how this came to us, there was a guy 2,500 years ago sat under a tree and woke up, and he had a whole bunch of people he went and taught. So after he died, the teachings became oral, and they were transmitted orally for a number of years. Nothing was written down for 200-300 years. So then we and of course, oral teachings with people wandering around, it became somewhat fragmented. People started disagreeing on things, and then they came back and they talked about it again. So there's this dialogue going on. Somewhere, probably about 200-300 years after that all started, the idea of a bodhisattva. Now, the bodhisattva actually came really early because it's in the Jataka tales, which are the stories of, the folk stories in Southern Asia of Buddha's previous lives, and he was a bodhisattva at that time. So the idea of a bodhisattva wasn't new, but the idea of practitioners aspiring to become Buddha brought to birth this idea of bodhisattvas. And as that came about, this new fork happened where Mahayana Buddhism started emerging. So you've got this happening 200-300 years after Buddha, and then somewhere a couple of hundred years, 400 years after that, started going to China. So you've got this really confusing and interesting mix of conversations and stories and trajectories going on. You've got the original teachings, whatever those were, becoming fragmented. You've got different teachings emerging. Somewhere in there, a large clump of teachings, which is now comes down to us, the Theravadan teachings, diverged from the Mahayana teachings. But the Mahayana teachings were clearly in conversation because the point of origin of this bifurcation is in northern India at this time, right? So they're all in conversation with each other. So and then went to China, and there are texts that were translated into Chinese in the 3rd, 4th century of the Common Era, that then came back to India, translated back into Sanskrit about that time, and there is no original Sanskrit text, so it's tough to know what started where. So there's an awful lot of theories about what came first and how it came first, but there's a big gray area in there as far as I'm concerned of maybe 400, maybe 500 years. So there's just a lot of stuff going on. And if you think about that, maybe it doesn't sound so much time, 2,000 years ago. 500 years ago, Europeans were just starting to poke their toe on the coast of this country, right? It's a long time. Anyway, so that's how it came down to us. So now let's look at the sutra itself. So a sutra, the word sutra means thread. And a thread, in that context, is kind of like an aphorism. So all that glitters is not gold. So there are a lot of aphorisms out there. On Wednesday evenings, we recently read the Udana, which is a series of stories, then with an exclamation from the Buddha at the end. The exclamation is kind of like an aphorism. So you string together a whole bunch of aphorisms and you make a story and you make a book, and somehow or other that becomes a sutra. But the sutra is the weaving together, it's really the weaving together of all of these threads to pull together a fabric that makes sense and a fabric that conveys a teaching. A sutra has a certain structure. Actually, let me get to a different place first, and then come to the structure of the sutra. I'm going to just talk about the title. So I pulled out a copy of the Lotus Sutra here. The classic commentaries on the Lotus Sutra are out of medieval China. They're by a guy by the name of Zhi, and they're maybe 1,000 pages long. I mean, one of them is just vast. But the longest one of those, he spends like 3/4 of his commentary talking about the title. Titles are really important. They convey a lot. So I'm just going to pass the title, and then we'll get into the body. Title: Maha Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutta Bhagavati. That's the full Sanskrit title. Maha, big. Why big? It's really small. Not clear to me. I like to think what's happening there is there's a little bit of deliberate irony going on, and it's like the whole universe in a blade of grass, which is kind of within this idea of emptiness that the Heart Sutra is about. So Maha, Prajna, Jna is knowledge, Prajna is wisdom. Prajna Paramita, there's a whole body of texts of sutras came out around this time I'm talking about, that were the Prajna Paramita Sutras. So you've got wisdom as distinct from knowledge. Wisdom, if you like, is heart, knowledge is head. Paramita. Paramita, we most often think of as the perfections, depending on which tradition you're following and how you're following it. There's 6, there's 10, there's one list of 10 here, there's another list of 10 over here, but they're like generosity, the precepts, energy, diligence, meditation or mindful, and then wisdom. So their practices, it's used as the perfection of wisdom, but those feel like different words, actually pointing at slightly different things to me. And that bridges, I think, into Avalokiteshvara, which we'll talk about in a minute, teaching the sutra. Because Avalokiteshvara is the bodhisattva of compassion, and the paramitas are directing us towards compassion. So I think there's an intentional confluence here of wisdom and compassion in the title. Paramita also passes as para, which means beyond, and mita means that which has arrived. Ita means that which has gone. This is something that happens with a lot of Sanskrit and Pali words. They have multiple roots, and they're intentionally chosen because they have multiple meanings, and it's really difficult to translate them because you've got to choose. But there's value in looking at the multiple meanings. So paramita can also mean that which has come from afar, that which goes afar, that which crosses over, which I think has parallels to Tathagata, the thus come one, thus gone one. And of course, it's often talked about as having parallels to the story of the boat crossing to the other shore, as that which takes us across. Hridaya is heart. That passes, I think, Hri means to give, Da means to take, and Ya is the union. So there's a giving and a taking coming together here. And there's a Hridaya Yoga, which is about this, and it's the Hridaya is the heart. But it's a heart in that sense of coming together, and it's an emotional and a spiritual heart, not the heart as in the intellectual core. So there's a lot of touching on heart here, and there's a lot of floating around this idea of not landing. That which comes, that which goes. Sutra we talked about. Sutra is the thread, and we're weaving all this together to create a fabric of teaching. And then Bhagavati, what's that doing in there? Bhagavati, if you in the old Pali or the Pali Sutras, the Buddha is often talked about Bhagavan, which is translated often as world honored one. Krishna, Vishnu, the deities in the Sanatana Dharma are often referred to as Bhagavan too, which has, so there's a side of it which is almost deific. Bhagavati is the feminine, and it alludes to something that is in the body of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the whole collection of them, where they're talked about as being the womb of the Buddha, the mother of and the womb of the Buddha. And there's something that happens in a lot of the Mahayana sutras where the sutra kind of stands in for the Buddha. So the sutra becomes this glorified object. And stupas were originally erected with the bones of the Buddha in it, or artifacts of the Buddha's cremation. And over time, they came to be erected around copies of sutras. So the sutra kind of stands in for the Buddha, and it becomes the womb. So this is all there in the title. I spent time on this because understanding why that title comes to be, how that title comes to be, tells us a lot about what this sutra is trying to tell us, where it's coming from, and where it is trying to lead us. And if we're to really incorporate the sutra in our practice, grounding ourselves on all of these elements that are, they're all there in it, taking all of that information and letting that soak into us can only help us. Okay, so now we get into the body of the sutra. So it starts where it doesn't start. It doesn't start. Most stories you read start once upon a time in a land far away, right? Sutras start, thus have I heard. At that time, at Jeddah Park, Vulture Peak, whatever, the Buddha, along with 1,250 arhats and 2,500 bodhisattvas, sat in some particular posture, and somebody asked him a question, and then he said, "Great question, well done, great question. Here's the answer. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing Prajnaparamita, clearly saw it's not there. What happened to it? Because it's there in it's really important to land a sutra in when, where, who was teaching, why, and what. And none of that's here. There's a reason. Because all the other Prajnaparamita sutras, the Diamond Sutra is one of them, and it's pride of place right at the beginning, and it's a really, really important part. In the Diamond Sutra, Buddha takes his bowl and he goes and begs, and then he comes back, and then there's the conversation. That's a really, really important chapter there. And in the Prajnaparamita Sutra, in 8,000 words, 25,000 words, 100,000 words, all of these have that beginning. So there's by omitting that, it changes the nature of this sutra, and it becomes a dharani, becomes something we chant, and it's no longer the teaching in the same way. It's a dharani, which is a magical, a mystical thing, which is why around much of the world people chant Kanji, Zaibo, Zetsugyojin, Hanya, Hara, Mita, Ji, Shoken, which is, it's not Japanese, kind of Japanese, but there's a lot of Chinese transliteration in there. Most people who chant that don't understand what it means. And it doesn't matter because it's a magical thing. But knowing that is useful, right? But now let's come back to that story, because actually in the original Sanskrit versions of the sutra, that story does exist, and it actually works to set up the players in this sutra who are Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara. And it exists it was translated into Tibetan, and it's a major text in Tibetan Buddhism in that Sanskrit form, with the introduction and with an ending. So in the introduction, Buddha is there, as he always is, because the sutra, classically, Buddha has to either teach or authorize the person who is teaching. So Buddha is there, Buddha settles into meditation. Avalokiteshvara is there, and we'll talk about why Avalokiteshvara in just a second. Avalokiteshvara is there, and he penetrates the 5 aggregates. And then Shariputra says, World Honored One, how should someone of good birth practice if they want to pursue the path of wisdom? Which is a great question, and it's a standard question that's asked a lot. And Buddha usually says, great question, here's the answer. And in this case, it's Avalokiteshvara does that answer. So, why Shariputra and why Avalokiteshvara? Avalokiteshvara is a bodhisattva of compassion. We don't have wisdom teaching the Wisdom Sutra, we have compassion, which ties back to Paramita and Hridaya in the title. So this isn't a teaching about knowledge or wisdom so much as a teaching about compassion, because that's where it's coming from. It's coming from Avalokiteshvara, which is the one who hears the cries of the world, the one who moves towards people's suffering. And Red Pine, who always does really interesting things in his commentaries, he draws a parallel because of what he does with Shariputra, which we'll get to next. He, at that same line, he says, well, Avalokiteshvara in this context is really a stand-in for Buddha's mother. Okay, the womb, and again, there's compassion in there, the feminine lineage, right? So then Shariputra. So I brought a couple of other stories. Shariputra, there's something in that several hundred-year period where the Mahayana sutras were coming into being that is really very interesting, where part of that discussion that's going on between all the traditions is the Buddha's core group of disciples, and under Shariputra, Moggallana, the whole crowd of them, right? Their names get brought into these Mahayana sutras, but in a somewhat comical and disparaging way. But it's a somewhat comical and disparaging way, because for the most part, the punchline is, you guys have got stuck. And they say, oh my goodness, you're right. Thank you, we did get stuck. Now let's take the rest of the journey. And the rest of the journey is opening up into this more compassionate way of being, which is Avalokiteshvara and the core of much of the intention of Mahayana. So Shariputra, he shows up in 2 stories I brought here. He shows up in this big story that I told you about. And the way he shows up in this story, he actually shows up a lot in this story, but there's one particular vignette where Manjushri, who's the Bodhisattva of wisdom, brings in the dragon girl who we found with a crowd of people. And he brings her back to the Buddha, and Shariputra's there. She's 8 years old. She's progressed way down the path of wisdom, and she's doing miraculous things and so on. And Shariputra says, you say that in no long time you shall attain the unexcelled way. This is hard to believe. What is the reason a woman's body is filthy? It is not a dharma receptacle. How can you attain unexcelled body, etc., etc.? So there's a classic pejorative in there, which is you have to have a man's body to wake up. But what then happens is, at that time, the dragon girl had a precious gem whose value was a bunch. She gave it to the Buddha, who accepted it. And then she said, I offered the precious gem, and the world honored one accepted it. Was that quick or not? Shariputra said, very quick. And the girl said, with your supernatural power, you shall see me achieve Buddhahood even more quickly than that. And she span around and did a few magic things, and she became a Buddha. And Shariputra says, oh my goodness, wow. So including Shariputra in this sutra is referring, because these were stories, I think my sense is there were stories in circulation. These stories were in circulation. They got captured in some of these sutras. And we're alluding to this kind of story by including Shariputra in here. So what this is pointing at is those gaps in Shariputra's knowledge. Here's one that goes deeper, same kind of story, but it goes deeper, and it's out of Vimalakirti Nirodesa Sutra. And Vimalakirti is a lay man who was sick, and Buddha had a whole bunch of bodhisattvas and disciples, And he sent them in one at a time, knowing that they were all going to get knocked about. Every single one of them gets knocked about. And when Shariputra goes in, the goddess comes out of the woodwork. And the goddess has lived there for an awfully long time, but nobody knows she's there or has seen her. So she comes out of the woodwork and she introduces herself. And first she causes flower petals to rain down. And the disciples, Shariputra in particular, try and brush them off, and they can't brush them off. Why can't we get rid of these? And she says, these flowers do not say these flowers are not proper. They are proper indeed. Such flowers have neither constructional thought nor discrimination. But the elder Shariputra has both constructional thought and discrimination. Right? Heart of the Heart Sutra, right? So can't get rid of the flower petal, can't brush them off because of this. And then, so she does, Shariputra does the same thing to the goddess. Goddess, what prevents you from transforming out of your female state? It's an impaired state, so you've got to transform out of it. Although I have sought so she talks about this, and then she employed her magical power to cause the elder Shariputra to appear in her form and to cause herself to appear in his form. So he says, oh my goodness, I can't get rid of this female form thing. What's going on? And she says, if the elder could change out of the female state, then all women could also change out of their female states. All women appear in the form of women in just the same way as the elder appears in the form of a woman. While they are not women in reality, they appear in the form of women. With this in mind, the Buddha said, in all things, there is neither male nor female. And then she did a bit more magic and changed everything back. So seems clear to me that by bringing these players in as the core of the Heart Sutra, we're focusing on compassion, and we're bringing compassion to bear on the Shariputras of this world, who are serious and advanced practitioners, but who are still stuck with some discriminating mind. So just a little coda, because this finishes the story and wraps it up, and then I'll finish, which is our stories all end, and they lived happily ever after, right? Our sutras all end with either the Buddha having some sort of final words to the person he's talking to, or if it was taught by somebody else, in this case Avalokiteshvara, he would say, well done, well done. Avalokiteshvara has clearly got it, and what he says is correct. And there are sutras where somebody else talks, and that's what happened. That, again, doesn't happen here. So it's, again, an indication of this dharani being taken out of the sutra. So with that, I will finish.